everyone. I am coming to you from Covey Wellness Center, and we are back with Karen and Tom for sort of a part two on what we were talking about last time on the podcast related to some of the concepts in solution-focused brief therapy, which is a modality that Karen and Tom have as one of their primary modalities of interest. And there's some really neat components of this therapy that really create some great desired outcomes for people. And so we're just going to expand a bit of that conversation. So if you missed last episode, you might want to go back and listen to that episode first before you hop onto this episode, because we're kind of picking up from there. Or maybe after this episode, you go back and listen and get that historical info. So again, we've got Karen and Tom here. So you'll recognize them from last time if you're watching on video, and maybe you'll recognize their voices if you're listening in. But we're going to talk today about the history of the desired outcome and imagining a preferred future. So those are kind of the big themes that we're going to be talking about and touching in on. And Tom and Karen are going to guide us. As always, I'm here to learn from them as well. And we'll just have a conversation about these and see where it takes us today. So, Tom, why don't you start us off and just tell us what do you mean by the history of the desired outcome? You know, put that in plain language for our listeners.
Yeah. So in our last conversation, we talked about goals and desired outcomes in the midst of goals. Like what difference? I think the question that we left with was, what difference will this make for me? And using that question to really dig into the meaning behind that goal, or the hope for the future that that goal presents for us. Right. And in doing so, opening up greater possibilities for how we can achieve that ultimate outcome that we desire. Right. And so one of the strategies that we use in solution-focused therapy, and I think we can apply to our daily lives in general, is taking the time to remember the presence of that desired outcome in our past. And then another one being taking the time to imagine what it could look like in our future. And so specifically with history, remembering the history of the desired outcome, it's a way that we can start to build hope and build momentum by seeing and remembering it in our past, building hope and momentum for small changes going forward in the future.
So can you talk a bit more about that? Maybe Karen, you have some thoughts, but when you say we're remembering, are we remembering times when this outcome was fulfilled previously? Are we remembering times when we have had other outcomes fulfilled? Like let's unpack that a bit more so that we maybe understand a little bit more what we're getting at there in that remembrance piece.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things it does is address a bit of a myth that solution-focused therapy doesn't look at the past, that it's just forward pointing, present pointing, happy, rah, rah, rah. And no, we actually really leverage the past, except in a different way. So rather than being problem-focused and sort of immersed in a problematic mindset, we're looking to the past for evidence of times when there were instances of the desired outcome that the client has that were present back then.
Okay.
And, things happen in life. And, perhaps something has happened that has resulted in a narrative of, I'm not very good. Well, I'm going to use myself here. I'm not very good at being on camera, public speaking in that regard. I prefer just to be one-on-one with clients. And so I actually took myself through, okay, when was a time in your past? Just think about the instances when you knew there was something in you that was able to show up, be present, be focused, and not worried about whether or not anybody's watching. And I reflected, and it's like, yeah, okay. And so it allowed me to shed that mindset, that narrative of, oh dear, I can't do this. I remembered. And so in therapy, we're helping our clients to effect change by recalling instances when their desired outcome showed up and
Yeah.
there, Tom.
Yeah.
Well, one of the challenges that often comes up too, and usually when I suggest doing this with a client, the first thing they'll say is, well, I've never experienced that before. I've never actually, I don't think I've ever felt this happiness that I desire. And what we're challenging with this exercise is inattentional blindness. And you may have, you can Google it, YouTube it. You may have heard of the gorilla experiment, where there's people passing a basketball between themselves. They have to do a certain pattern. And while they're doing that, a gorilla walks right between all 10 of them, but none of them notice because they're so focused on the passing pattern that they're supposed to do. And there's all these kinds of studies called the gorilla. You can Google it. But the point being that when we get so focused on our problem, or when we get so focused on the big things that weigh us down, we can easily, and by no fault of our own, just lose sight of what we've done well in those moments. And so when someone counters me, when we start talking about this and someone counters, I've never felt, maybe their desired outcome is just to feel happy again. I've never actually felt happy. Well, we don't have to necessarily even look for that time when you felt what your current definition of happiness is. We can look at, when did you feel the happiest in your past?
Right.
One question.
I was close to it.
Yeah. One question I'll use in session that I learned from a guy named Elliot Connie is, he asked, if I were to watch a movie of your life, and I were watching this whole movie of your life, the biography, at what point in your life would I notice and recognize that you were the happiest that you've been? Not the happy that you want to be necessarily, but the happiest that you've been. And then we start to dig in, and part of remembering the history of that outcome, dig into, what were you doing? What was I doing at that time when I was the happiest? What was I saying? Even down to absurd details of, like, what was I eating? What was I wearing? Who was I spending my time with? And just dissecting what was going well and why was it going well at that time? What other factors were involved there? And doing so can move past that inattentional blindness and can foster that hope that I've done this before, I've been here before, and I now can see and remember all of the factors that were at play as I was doing that.
Yeah,
sort of. Tom. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
I was just going to say about all of those factors, this is about a richness of the description of what happened then. It's not just recalling in general, but the specifics that actually help to enrich the description. So whether we're doing it in the history or whether we're doing it looking at the preferred future, we're working at a rich description that takes you out of that basketball court where you don't see the gorilla, and puts you into a mindset of possibility that leverages your innate talent, strengths, abilities, and connects you to that point when indeed you had experienced happiness.
Yeah.
Otherwise you wouldn't know what it was at all.
I think we have those confirmation biases, right, that are built by the stories we're telling ourselves about our lives, right? And so that story of I've never felt happiness is a bias that's then filtering out all of the other evidence, even if it's a small amount of evidence. But there is evidence to the contrary. And so to expand that and to bring our attention to that, and to really, as you say, Karen, like, give the detail to it. I know that's true of gratitude practices as well. It's not just naming, I'm thankful for my cup of coffee, but the impact neurobiologically and in terms of our mood is to really stay with that gratitude, to describe it, to be as specific as we can in order to reap the benefit of that. And so to, to build those neurological connections and things. But, I think people can really resonate with the concept that we have blind spots. That we have things, whether that's a pattern in our personality, whether that's our experience that's built a particular pattern, we begin to operate in these well-worn grooves, of behavior and thinking. And we do kind of get these blinders on, and that's really normal for all of us. And so exercises like this that can expand that and have us not be able to see the periphery, right? Or step back. We talk about sometimes it's important to move the camera in and look closer, but sometimes it's also important to back the camera up. And so these perspective shifts really do matter for people. And they begin to see, instead of these perceived limitations, they begin to see their strengths, they begin to see their resilience, they begin to see those possibilities. And it is very hopeful. And it's a different story than what they've been telling themselves. So that's awesome.
Our bias also clouds the fact that we're here. We're here right now having this conversation and being part of this process, listening to this podcast, or sitting with your therapist, or even just sitting with a journal, or sitting by yourself pondering these things. The fact that you're having this thought process, having this conversation, proves that there is strength and there's resilience there. And there's something that you did, that you thought, that you said, that some action that you took to get to this point of trying to move forward towards health. But it's so easy to lose sight of that. And I'm guilty of that too. As I'm struggling through my challenges and through the things that I face down every day, to lose sight of the fact that in the midst of facing those down, I'm still here.
We can diminish
so
that.
Powerful.
Yeah, it's so powerful.
Tom, that is powerful. And I really like how you're weaving that history back into the present now. And, part of that history is being able to see, here's where I am now. And as we're helping people look at the history, we want to help them see through a different lens other than that lens of negative bias. And so I like Elliott Connie's example of, looking at a film of your life. But in addition to that, you can look at your life through the lens of someone who was present at the time. And for me, what comes up as I sit here talking about the past, but being in the present here, is a grade 6 teacher that I had. You would relate to this, being a teacher, Sarah.
Yeah.
Her name is Brenda Sarah, just an amazing human being. And I really, really credit her for being such an instrumental human being in seeing the innate goodness in me. She set me up for victory. And so, knowing that those things she saw in me and she brought me to my potential. A maternal grandmother, another person who did something similar. So in therapy, we will do that. Who was it who would champion you? And honestly, the person will beam and shine. And so we can look through their eyes and borrow that perspective of that person and now bring it into the present, bring that with us.
Yeah, I love that. And it speaks to the power of the other, which we know is so important too. So it's in the moment, maybe with your therapist, you're engaging with that person in a supportive way, but you're also harnessing that energy and strength from these people in your past who have been champions for you, voices for you, speaking goodness over you or declaring things about you that have in some ways become realities. And there are also, people who would struggle because what they maybe remember most is the people who said, you're not going to amount to anything, right? Those are the louder voices. And I often share this with my clients, but it's so important to choose your voices. Who gets to speak into your experience? Who gets the authority to do that? Why do they have the authority to do that? Why do you trust them to do that? Because we have a lot of voices that we give a lot of credence to that really ought to be filtered out, that they are not the voices we want to listen to. So it's a great way to kind of bring it to the voices that actually matter in our pathways, in our resilience, and, drawing that strength from the past. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good analogy, Sarah, because as we've said, to sum it up, like we can lose sight of what's in the past in our present as we're facing down. But this exercise and this using of our imagination kind of builds off and aligns with other research too, in terms of, you've probably heard about athletes, imagining their backstroke as they're going through their swimming, and imagining taking their shot and practicing those things and going through those visualizations. And that's essentially what we're doing here too. Is we're using the power of our imagination and the power of our brain, our memories and our imagination to build up those physiological that hopefulness really is what it is.
Yeah.
And having those, and there are studies that show that when we do visualization of things, that it has impact on those parts of our brain that think it's real. Obviously it's not, but it has that long-term impact of building that momentum towards change. And that's a good transition into the other aspect of this that we do, is not just remembering and being intentional about remembering the past that we've forgotten, but also imagining the possibility of the future.
Yeah.
Taking the time to really imagine and use the strengths of our creativity and imagination to imagine what could it look like if I were to experience this tomorrow or the next day, even if my circumstances don't change. And taking time to, as Karen had said before, of creating that rich description of what this could possibly look like.
Yeah, that rich description of that preferred future is so important. And when a client will come in, we touched on this last time. Well, what do you want? And they might be really quite sort of vague about it. Well, to be out of this mess,
to feel better or something.
Yeah,
okay, you got it. Yeah.
Ultimately, we help them to distill it down to that real core value that they would like to have as an anchor for their life, where we can set a compass, set on that direction as their preferred future that isn't going to change. So let's say peace, we distill it down to peace. I want to live a life of peace. I just want that to be the thread in my life.
Yes, we do, right, Tom? We do want to live lives of peace, as Karen says that. Everybody in the audience is like, yes, we do. We do.
Yeah, it's a really
it resonates,
right? With the human experience, there's there are a lot of tumultuous waters around us, and to be able to attain peace, no matter what the storm, is really crucial. And so we don't want just sort of a vague idea of what that's going to look like, because it's hard to know what's the landscape look like if I'm heading towards, I don't know.
Right.
What are the waypoints? And so bringing in a really rich description of what that might be, that will involve alignment of their values. And we're also going to bring in the physical experience of that. How will I know that I'm aligned with peace?
Right.
What will be the signals? And how will I know when I'm getting a little blown off course?
Right. Yeah. I think that's so interesting too, because what we're really talking about, and maybe we can speak to this, is the shifts that these perspectives take. But what it sounds to me like is we're really harnessing for the good our ability to imagine scenarios. It's very easy for us to imagine worst case scenarios and to envision futures that are bleak and terrible. Somehow we have the misfortune of that being the easy one without provocation to come forward. And so this is a way of saying, we know the impact of people ruminating and envisioning these catastrophic futures or these bleak futures for themselves, and how that impacts their mental health. And what we're saying is, let's use that ability that you have, but let's redirect it over here where it's going to serve you well. We can, you already, it's that sort of, if you know how to worry, you know how to meditate kind of idea, right? Like it's the same kind of muscles, but let's work them for you. Let's not have them working against you. And it's so empowering to do that, to say, oh goodness, I could actually, I know what it's like to stay and perseverate on a thought. So maybe I can translate those skills actually to this positive outcome. And I could see that being a shift. But what difference do these kinds of shifts make for people in therapy?
Well,
go ahead, Tom.
You can go, Karen. Okay. Well, one of the ways that I do this in a session with clients, and again, it seems like so much with solution focused people are like, are you sure? This is kind of weird. But one of the things that we do is even just taking it right down to the minutia of a day, and just starting to imagine, because I think that's a great example you gave, Sarah, that this is what happens when we're having a panic attack or when we're having extreme anxiety, is we're just worrying about the worst of the future. and it's affecting our physical bodies.
Right.
So when we do this exercise in session, I'll say, if you were to imagine tomorrow, everything's the same, life is the same, nothing's changed, but you have this peace in your life. This is another exercise I got from Elliot Connie and Adam Thrower. But you have this peace in your life. What would be the first thing that you notice when you wake up? Like before your alarm even goes off, or maybe that's it. Maybe you wake up before your alarm goes off.
Right.
What's the first thing you would notice in yourself? How would you go about your day differently? What would be the first thing you do after you get out of bed? And it sounds kind of weird and like ridiculous as you start to go through it, but we dig apart every little bit of how would you be brushing your teeth if you felt this kind of peace? What would you do next? Okay, so how would you make your coffee? Or you grind your coffee beans.
Dentist would be happy.
Your coffee?
Yeah. I don't know, jump in with the dentist would be happy because they're always like, don't brush so hard. Don't, you're eroding your gums.
Yeah.
And,
So it sounds like, Sarah, for you, if you were brushing your teeth with peace, you'd be brushing them more gently.
I'd be gentle and I'd be thoughtful and methodical about it. Right. Like you're right. It's kind of funny. And I interject with that, but we have evidence of when we're doing it to the contrary. Like people are being told by the dentist all the time that you're brushing your teeth too aggressively, And so it's like, it does matter in the minutia. It does. We do get impacts from how we go about our day from that place, one place or the other. Yeah.
And the value of imagining the difference that desired outcome would make in our day is, again, it's that same inattentional blindness thing. It then opens up the possibilities and the opportunities for us that it's not prescriptive. We don't end the session saying, okay, now go brush your teeth more softly. Think about good thoughts when you're grinding your coffee.
No.
And we don't prescribe anything, but it opens up the possibility in our minds and in our imagination, and that hope for, I think the feedback I get back from clients every single time is that started out weird, but actually now, after like 10 minutes of thinking about that, it feels possible. It feels like it's not some big workbook that I have to do for the next 6 weeks. It's possible that tomorrow when I wake up, I can think, okay, if I were feeling peaceful right now, what would I do? And then I can start taking those actions to impact that feeling in my life. It's not too dissimilar from cognitive behavioral therapy, where we're shifting our actions to impact our emotions. But solution focused, we're imagining what that future could be like, so that we can know what works best for us in our lives.
Yeah, if I could encapsulate solution-focused brief therapy in a couple of words, I would have to say transformation and imagination. Leveraging imagination is huge. And Sarah, you mentioned a few minutes ago, meditation. And so guided meditations are really, really useful in eliciting a rich description of that particular day, when they can imagine themselves waking up, or imagine myself here at any time. And through a guided meditation, they will fill in the pieces of what that looks like.
Right.
And then when we complete that exercise, they have tapped into their subconscious, their innate strengths, abilities, desires. It informs them, excuse me, this is the pathway forward. And so there's imagination everywhere, whether we're looking back to the history of the outcome and just reimagining, or to the preferred future and imagining, what would I be doing? What would someone else notice that I'm doing when I am feeling peaceful? And now bringing that into the present, where I've actually aligned my thoughts with an emotion that's playing out in my body. And now I can feel my body relaxing. I can notice my tight core opening up, expanding, and leaving more room now for adventure and joy, compassion, curiosity.
Yeah, and I absolutely don't want to minimize the complexity of those kinds of exercises, but it makes me think of like going to your happy place, right? Like it makes me think of giving yourself, as overly simplistic as that is, I know, but people can relate to that idea of like when I can enter into and imagine myself on that beach or in that beautiful garden or in that space, it elicits this kind of emotional reality that I want to live in. And we start to shift because we're controlling our perceptions, and our perceptions are what fuels our responses. So there's just such an amazing way that we can activate our imagination, which we all have access to really heal, right? And also reveal things, in those spaces. And what's coming to mind actually is kind of tying in with something you said, Tom, about how sometimes your clients are like, I don't know about this exercise. And you were saying, Karen, taking people through guided meditations and things. I think it just speaks to the importance of having a really strong trust and therapeutic alliance with your therapist. That's such a huge, well, in all the research, that's the single most important thing in terms of therapeutic success, is that alignment with a therapist and that ability to trust them. And I think there is a bit of that risk taking that can happen when you're in a relationship with a therapist where this is kind of weird, but I trust you, Tom, and I'm gonna go with you on this, and we're gonna talk all the way through it, even though you're asking me to do this exercise that kind of feels a little bit outside my comfort zone. I'm not sure where you're going with that. Or, Karen, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to enter into a meditation, which when you're in a meditation, you're guiding, it's very quiet. And so all of this is happening internal to the client. Like the therapist is not getting a rundown on how their imagination is painting the picture, right? They're just helping them do that for themselves and empowering them to go into those places. And then it's sort of, when the meditation ends, there's usually a bit of a like debriefing or reporting back, like what was coming up for you? What did you notice? What changed for you in that? And in a way, the therapist is in a lot of ways kind of hands off of that, that process. So there's this real importance that's coming forward for me in just having people who you trust walking with you through these kinds of exercises, and being able to not feel that resistance in the sense of it's going to prevent me from doing it. Like there's a natural resistance to trying something new or expanding or going into a meditation or an imaginative exercise. But if you know that your therapist is there for you and has this consistent, you can trust that. You can take some risks that you might otherwise not take. And I think that's important. Does that make sense? Like just that's so important in this, to have that alliance?
Yeah, for sure.
For those of you listening, I'm getting nods from Karen and Tom.
Sarah, it does bring up that it's not always going to be about the wonderful connection with your preferred future, with your desired outcome, with peace. If that's what it is. So life consists of going through turbulent times, times of mountains, times of valleys. And so there can be environments you're in that can be very destabilizing. I recall one recently that I was in, and my spirit would just not settle. And I just felt, and I understood why. Nonetheless, I couldn't get to a place in that framework of that place of peace. And I think it's really important for people to know that's okay. This isn't about, from here on in, I'm going to always be peaceful. I'm not, right, so I must have done something wrong. I'm a failure at this. No, this is life. And so now what we're doing is teaching our clients to be able to do this themselves more and more. That is our goal, so that they can become their own therapists, and then do check-ins with us as therapy goes along, where sometimes those storms can be really destabilizing. And so they might come back for another series of sessions, and we'll go back to those imaginal places that are real, and kind of get the train back up on the tracks. And then, off you go again.
But that circles back to what Tom was saying about even the acknowledgement that we sometimes dismiss, that we're in the present, that we're asking the questions, that we're showing up to the journal. When we have those experiences that take us outside of our desired outcomes and preferred futures, it's really just an invitation back to our tools, right? An invitation back. It's not a failure of any kind. It's the regular process of life and the ebb and flow of that. And so we don't feel any longer paralyzed by that, perhaps because we know how we can return back to ourself and to those spaces where we want to be, So again, so empowering, which of course is what we are wanting to do. So much of therapy too is taking all those externalized controls in our lives and bringing it back to our own personal agency and making people feel empowered with choices and tools and things, again, for themselves, not feeling like they're tethered to the craziness and the chaos in the world, but they can get back, to something grounded and that resonates for them. We're going to be wrapping up here shortly. So what about just some practical things? So for listeners, how could they put some of this into their daily lives if they wanted to, have more imagination and transformation in their daily lives? How could they do that? Are there some simple tips? I mean, obviously, we're big proponents of supporting therapy, and you can reach out to Covey Wellness Center to work with Karen or Tom or any of the other therapists on the team to support you in moving forward in some of these things in your lives. But what are some just takeaway tips for today? Tom, you want to start us off?
Sure, yeah. I think starting with what we talked about last time of when we've got a hope for change in our life, whether it's a goal or whatever, first digging into what difference will that make to get to the core of what meaning that has for us. And then from there, basically what we've been talking about, asking those questions we've been referring to throughout our conversation today, of taking intentional time to think back of when that has been present, even in the slightest little bit in our past, and what were the details of that experience, of that presence, of that peace or that joy or that contentment, whatever it is, and really digging into that. Again, it can be journaling, it can be just in sitting alone in your thoughts, but pushing past that inattentional blindness, and really digging up the history of how that has been present in our lives and why it might have, what we've been doing that might have caused it to be present in the past. And then asking questions like, if I were experiencing this peace tomorrow, what would I first notice? Or asking those questions, if I were experiencing it throughout my day, how would my partner notice? Or how would my children notice? And what would I be thinking about when I'm sitting in traffic? And just having those kind of reflective thoughts to build up the momentum of our imagination, because it's through that momentum that we can start to see build possibilities for change.
Even well said, Tom. Well said. And I think in addition to thoughts is to pay attention to our body, to really learn to attune to the body, because our subconscious is going to send signals, tightness, across the shoulders, maybe a headache, sore back, perhaps a knot in the stomach, something that's cueing us. And so through that, being able to align the thoughts of peace and notice the impact it has in the body, and recall, I've been there before in this place of peace. I can get there again. My history tells me I've been there. I can do it again. And my preferred future tells me that this is where I want to align with. And so I'm using my whole self to be able to bring myself back, notice that I'm straying, and bring myself back anywhere, anytime.
I think that we do know when we're aligned if we're paying attention. Like, it's sort of going even to that gorilla experiment. Like, if we're so distracted by our patterns that we're not paying attention to things, that's where we go wrong. And I think that's a big part of therapy, is giving ourselves space and time to be attentive to ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, our relationships, our bodies. There's so much wisdom there that's there for us to pay attention to, but we live really disconnected from that a lot of times. And I'm speaking for myself as well. We can go through a whole day. I always give the example of like, I can go through a whole day and by the end of the day, my shoulders are like this. And I didn't really notice how they crept up because I didn't pause to ground myself or check in again. And so, it just goes to show how inattentive we can become to ourselves. And so making space for that, whether that's a guided meditation, a journaling exercise, a contemplative walk, a conversation with a trusted friend, sharing our stories, I could see how that would be just so hopeful to share our preferred futures with our spouse or with our good friends, because that's going to bring them into that same energy and momentum. And maybe there are some people who are aligned with the same preferred future, and that brings in the social support component of that. Like, these are the people that are going to rally around me to move towards the future that I am envisioning for myself. And that collective envisioning, if you will, has a lot of momentum too. So I think I can see a lot of applications to this. I just love the emphasis on imagination. As someone who really, is fired up about creativity, I think C.S. Lewis does a bunch of writing about the imaginative life, and I'm not going to speak eloquently about it now because I'm not going to remember all the components, but just how that's something that's divinely given, that we can imagine, and that imagination is this tremendous gift. And it's sort of this overwhelming, amazing thing that we as humans can do, so I love that imagination and transformation. That's a great way to sum it up. Any final thoughts before we wrap up today, that we just to close off our challenge or our chat about this? I know we have more on desire. So we didn't talk as much about desired outcomes and goals this time. So just a reminder that we do have an episode on that's come out just before this one. So please do go back if these themes and modalities are really resonating with you. You'll probably find that really helpful as well. But any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
I just want to thank you. As you know, I'm just a real fan of this. It makes a big impact in clients' lives. It makes a big impact in my own life.
Yeah.
And so I really do try to live my life in a manner that accesses the solution-focused mindset, so that I can navigate through whatever comes my way. And bring myself back. And it overall really contributes to a growing positive mindset, not a fakey positive, but one grounded in knowledge that I can do this. I'm empowered.
Love that. Yes. Tom, anything from you?
Yeah, I would say the same. You may have heard it as I was describing earlier, that like this stuff gets me really excited. Because I think that so much hopelessness is such a burden, and like Karen said, I try and act on these things too throughout my life, because just to reiterate the big idea from all of this is that taking time to remember the history and to imagine the future can build so much hope and so much momentum, even just for the slightest changes that can set us on a path in a different direction. So I'm super excited. Yeah, for sure. And power in the hope that comes from that.
Yeah, I often talk about spiritual practices, and some spiritual practices people would say, oh, these are like common ones that people know, prayer, meditation, that kind of thing. But sometimes I'll look at something through the lens of a spiritual practice, and I often will say the spiritual practice of remembering. Right. And the power of that as something that we do actually to holistically enliven ourselves, to bolster ourselves, to remember, right. And not be a forgetful person, even in our own histories. It's fascinating. So I could say a lot more about that, but today is not the day to do so. For those of you who are listening, thanks for showing up. Thanks for staying through till the end of the episode. I hope you'll check out some other episodes on the Covey Wellness Center podcast with others on our team on different topics. we're really trying to bring some value and give back to our community and beyond. And I hope this has been helpful. If it has, can you please share it with a friend who might really be interested? Maybe you share part one, they're going to want to hear part two, or maybe something just resonated with somebody who's feeling a bit hopeless. As Tom's saying, hopelessness is a real thing, and it's a burden. And so if this can bring a bit of light to that, please consider that. And of course, as a new podcast, if you can subscribe and leave a rating, that's going to help people find us and know that these resources are here. So for Covey Wellness Center podcast. And if you are looking for support, we are able to support people primarily in Ontario, in person and online, but we do have clients all across Canada. And so you are more than welcome to reach out to us through the website. There's a contact us form. It's super simple, and that my team would be in touch with you to get some support. So I think that's a big first step for a lot of our growth and healing. It's just to ask for help, and that's what we're here for. So if you have any questions, reach out to us there. Thanks again for tuning in. Thank you, Tom and Karen, for joining for this second conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm constantly, as we said, we're constantly preaching to ourselves too as therapists, because we're humans living out the challenges of life right alongside our clients, fellow sojourners, as Yalom would say. So with that, we will go and imagine our preferred future for today. And thank you for tuning in. Take care.